To me, being a citizen means to be engaged where I am. Um, Oftentimes, we think about citizen only in terms of immigration status, and that's important. Obviously, I myself am not a U.S. citizen yet, so I can't partake in voting or things like that. But I am able to do a lot of other things if I take the idea of citizen, which means to be engaged where I am. If I take that seriously, then I am able to be a citizen in different ways, and not just in the ballot or voting for someone. And that I think is important, especially when we're talking about immigrant communities and things like that. Um, and for example, I work at a place called Citizens League, and citizen is central to our work and everything. But I think sometimes that there is apprehension, and I know I was a little hesitant to approach the Citizens League a few years ago when I was learning about it, because it was the Citizens League, and so because I had always only thought or had been talked to about citizen only in terms of immigration status. So therefore, I felt I couldn't be part of the Citizens League, and so, but that has changed, and I've sort of found different ways to look at citizen or being a citizen, and I really take ownership of that terminology because I think that using your citizenship means that you can get involved in all kinds of things and not just, again, like on the ballots, the way we think about your citizenship. And it's also empowering too, because it means that I can get involved in the electoral process in different ways, maybe not voting, but working with people in getting elected and getting voters out to vote. It means that I can go and help clean up my neighborhood, and there are different ways of practicing citizenship that I think is very important. And also, to me, before I always thought about citizen only in immigration terms, and so I never quite felt like I belonged in different places, in different communities, and now that I found this new idea to think about citizenship or citizen as being engaged, that is very grounding to me, and it makes me feel like I belong in different places, like I can be involved in different things, and that I think is important, again, when you talk about community and belonging, but also when you talk about citizenship and how that can ground a person in places or in activities and so on. I think that you can belong to different communities. For example, I'm a Latino student, so therefore I belong to the Latino community, but I'm also an immigrant, and that means I belong to a bigger group of people. But I also live in Minneapolis, so I belong to that sort of geographic entity, then my neighborhood, and then my block. And so I think there are different communities, and I think everybody will define that in their own way. And I think that you belong in, I think you are a part of a community if you see it yourself. Again, I think we all define that in different ways. But I think community is effective when you see yourself as part of it. I think there are times when you are in a community and maybe you don't feel like you belong, um, and that might be I don't know. I'm thinking about places where I was and I was part of the community, but I didn't feel like I belonged, and it might have been because maybe there weren't people I identified with, or I didn't feel like I was getting something out of it. And it just didn't feel right for me to be part of that. On the other hand, I think to feel part of a community is to be able to get something out of it, or to be able to contribute something to it, and that you identify with the community or with members of the community. And I think there is also something about, being in a sort of safe space where you can have community, create community in ways that are not discouraging to people. Because I think that's when it breaks down, where you don't feel like you belong to that, and you want to not be part of it. Yeah, with Navigate, it's very issue specific, and that is undocumented students going to college, and that I think brings a lot of people together. One, because it's about students. I think most people, like the idea that all students are able to prepare themselves to do well in their lifetime. And I think it's also an issue that that I think makes people think about, like, what do you mean, this student who's really smart, who's doing really well, like, cannot access this or that just because of their immigration status, when they are part of the community, when they're here, and so there are. So I think the issue unites different stakeholders, but obviously there is a community of students who finds the information that Navigate uses or has useful. There is, a target to communicate with families, and because I think the information is relevant to their lives, or our families' lives, and that it's also very, very unique to certain communities or part of communities, and I think that's important because families have access to information in ways that are relevant to them, but also very culturally relevant to the families too. And then there is also a part of reaching out to teachers and counselors and community members who work with immigrant families. And we use different messaging for each group that we're trying to reach. And because that's important, we don't, right, like, you can't have a blanket statement and expect everybody to get it. And I think that's important for us as an organization to create a community with people, so that they find it relevant, they find it useful. And it's also, the work with Navigate, it's also about changing minds, because it's, I'm thinking, sort of going back to the question about citizenship, and there is, many people think about citizenship just in legal terms, and so, Navigate works with undocumented students, and many people have this black and white way of thinking, which is, what part of illegal don't you understand? And so, to us, it's also important to create messages that are positive about immigrants, so that people sort of think twice before just assuming, what part of illegal don't you understand, and take another look at people and students and their families and what they're doing in their education and their importance to the state, to their communities, and so on. So I think it depends on who we're talking to. There are students who have been told they can't go to college, they can't do this or that just because of their immigration status. And sometimes people assume that just because they're an immigrant from whatever, that they're undocumented, and because they're undocumented, they can't do X, Y, and Z. When in fact that's not the reality. I mean, sure, there are some barriers to some things, but most of the time it's just myths that are not real. And so, we're talking to a student who's being told you can't go to college, you can't do this or that. It's about introducing that student to other undocumented students who actually went to college, are going to college, and are using the different strategies to pay for it, and so on. If it's families, in families, there is a big worry about their children applying to college, and is immigration going to come after not just the student but the family? And so it's a real fear that is based on assumptions that are not real. And so it's about talking to parents about your student may apply to college, and that doesn't mean or there is no risk of immigration ever knowing about the family and all of that, because of laws that protect student privacy and all that. And so we get into the weeds of a lot of things to make sure parents understand that their kids are safe, that their family is safe, and that their kids going to college is actually a good thing. And for staff and community members and things like that who work with immigrant families, it's been a lot about, introducing them to undocumented students in college. I remember times when we were doing presentations, and then someone would raise their hand and be like, undocumented can go to college, and we're like, here is one. And so just by, I think sometimes the physical being of someone changes hearts and minds of people, and that I think is one of the most powerful things that we have at our disposal, that students don't want other students to go through what they went through, and they're willing to share their stories and experiences, and I think a lot of professionals, when they hear these kind of stories, and we break down the law, and we break down the stories of students and what in their position professionals can do and all that. I think it changes people's ideas of undocumented students and their families, or immigrants almost generally, and want to do something different and want to take different approaches to working with immigrant families. I think in terms of bringing people to share a vision, I think there is a lot of, again, going back to citizenship principles, which is creating a process for people to be engaged. I, for us, it's important to talk to people first, um, and see where they are and what kind of work they've done and what things they're interested in, um, and then and an important thing that we want to do from the beginning is, um, are people willing to commit to things, and not just talk about them, because we can talk for a long time all the time, and that's fun sometimes. And then we can write really great reports and studies and so on. But I think when the rubber hits the road is, what are you going to do about it? And that, I think, is the $1,000,000 question. And for us, that is important, that people want to talk about things, but people also want to commit to creating solutions. And the way I think it's our civic policy approach is that it's about this, big picture about what democracy should be like, and that is that that in order to have a better democracy, we need people to learn how to govern. And I think, you can see that today, especially, this is the only time I'm too young to know about other times, but, the polarization in politics and so on, and how, especially in government, but also in other sectors, is that in order to get things done, it rarely happens today. And so I think, we don't have a leadership issue. We don't have a money issue. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is a governing issue. And I think people in many places don't know how to govern. And so to us, again, governance is important. And so that's why the process of talking to people first, seeing if they want to commit to getting things done, and not just get things done at the legislature, but also make things happen, in their own communities, in their own circles, in their own jobs. And that goes back to how people govern and how people want to choose to be governed. And I think we've gone really far from good governance, and we don't have good governance in many different levels, and not just in governments. And so to us, the way to bring people in a vision is to share different values, and to share core values and core principles that you can take the same approach and work on different issues. But that process of being engaged in something needs to be shared by those who are engaged. And the reality is that takes a lot of time. It takes resources. But the great thing is that if you follow those steps, those solutions are, more long-term, and people feel like they, invested well in that. And that, I think. So I was born in Mexico, and I came to the U.S. when I was 15. I was an undocumented student then, and I went to high school here in St. Paul, Minnesota. and I remember I dropped out of high school at some point, and I went back, and I think sort of going back to this question about citizenship and belonging and all of that, to me, it was really hard to be in school and having people telling me like that I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that, and so I dropped out of high school. Like, well, why should I stay in school if I'm gonna be able to get the same job I can get in 10th grade, right? And I think that was the case for a lot of other students too. And then I went back to school, and that's, I think, when I was like, you know, I don't want to work at a restaurant for the rest of my life, and I actually like school, and I you know, and I was doing well before I dropped out, and so I think from there I was very committed to going to college and graduating from high school, and so I looked for help from different places, and because I learned that I couldn't do things alone, and so if I wanted to achieve something, I needed to do it with other people, and so I found like College Possible, former Admission Possible, and I got a lot of help in sort of learning about college and things like that. You know, no one in my family had ever gone to college or graduated from high school, and so the fact that I was going to graduate from high school was a big deal in my family and for me. But I was able to go to Augsburg College, and you know, when I was at Augsburg, I was very active in the student campus, and I was very active also outside. And I was lucky enough to not have to work to pay for my tuition and all that, and so that allowed me to do a lot of other things. And so I had an internship every semester somewhere, and that was really valuable because I was able to build a network of people who supported me and cared about me, and you know, and I was in student government for a long time because, again, you know, people for a long time had been telling me like, you can't do this, you can't do that, and so I almost took this rebellious approach, like, watch me do it, and so a lot of times I found myself in places, you know, people told me I couldn't be in, and sort of being able to prove people wrong was kind of fun, but it was also really tiring because it was a lot of work, and I was constantly, you know, trying to prove people wrong, and then one of the things I learned was through mentors and connections was that I remember someone who was my mentor, and you know, and she was really great, and we'll, you know, meet every month and talk and things like that, and that was really helpful because I never had that, and one of the things I remember she told me was that I was telling her, like, I always feel like I'm trying to prove people wrong, and like and I get tired, like it's always constant all the time, and then she said, why don't you try doing things you want to do? Like actually do things because you want to do, not because you feel you have to do them. And that was really important to me because then I was like, you know what, I actually really like student government, and I'm not doing it because I'm proving people wrong. I mean, I was, but I actually really enjoyed it, and so I changed my approach to things, and you know, and then I felt happier, and I felt more comfortable about things I was doing, and you know, and I ended up getting elected student body president on campus, you know, the first undocumented student in Minnesota to do it, and it was like you know, proving people wrong in some way, but it was also something I wanted to do, and that I was excited about. And you know, now I work at the Citizens League, and I was able to get involved in Citizens League as a student here on campus when Citizens League was doing a study on immigrant students in higher ed, and I was able to contribute to the study and then actually see some of the recommendations we had as students, part of the study, and actually moving them forward. And this year, only or alone in 2003, we were able to pass the Minnesota Dream Act, which was a huge victory because we've been trying for a long time. But now I was doing as part of my job, and I was getting paid for it, to go out and and talk to legislators and talk to students and talk to families and all that. And that's I think is really rewarding to be in a place where you feel like you're contributing and where you feel challenged and all of that. And that was my experience here at Augsburg too. And that's my experience at Citizen SIG, and now with Navigate. I think a mistake I made was when I assumed I knew everything. For example, deferred action, which is related to undocumented students and being protected from deportation and a work permit and things like that, which is beneficial to students. One thing I made a mistake was in telling a student what I thought it was without really knowing the details about it. And so I struggle with it still today because I've looked for the student because I feel really bad I gave him wrong information. And like I don't know if the student ended up applying and things like that. And so I feel guilty about it. And so I hope he ended up applying for deferred action. But what I learned from it, which I think happens, is that we all make mistakes, but we should be able to learn from those. And what I learned from it is that even though sort of my world revolves around undocumented students, that doesn't mean I know everything, and that I myself also need to take the time to talk to professionals about, if it's the law or things like that, so that I am well prepared to be able to talk to others about things like that. And I think that's important for us as young people, that it's okay to make mistakes sometimes, but to also take the time to reflect on it and talk to other people about it, because making mistakes means could mean that others are affected negatively by that, and so other people should be involved in that and trying to resolve it. In my case, in that case, it wasn't necessarily, I think, that damaging. But I did have to talk to someone and sort of try to find the student and things like that and try to correct it. But more importantly too is that I'm not making the same mistake, and that I'm taking my time to learn about things and so on. I think two things. One, I think that I really like the idea of that we use at the Citizen SIG, which is that we're all that we are all policymakers. I think a lot of the times we think of makers only like elected officials, or only in Washington, D.C. or at the state capitol in St. Paul. And what I like this idea of, everyone is a policymaker, is that we all have something to contribute to something. And that also means that we're policymakers everywhere, and that, our actions and are part of a bigger picture and are part of a culture. And whether that's at work, at a school, or at church, or if you work in government, there, creating good policies is important, and also being a civic leader. I think we often think that and praise public service, and when we think about public service, we only think about elected officials, so people who work in government, and that's one thing, and that's important. But I think we should all see ourselves as civic leaders, and that we have and we can do something where we are, and that oftentimes we assume poor people can contribute to this and that, and this idea that we're all civic leaders means that no matter our circumstances, we can all do something, and we all have something to contribute, and we all need to take different approaches to creating change and doing things. The other thing I think for us as young people that is important to do is to find places where we're challenged in our ideology. I think, and I myself have sort of, sorry, I got distracted. I think myself, I count myself or I've sort of sometimes found myself in bubbles where everybody thinks the same as I do, and everybody wants to take the same actions as I do, and so on. And that's fine sometimes, but I think it's important that we find people who challenge us, and that we find people who disagree with us, because by talking to people who disagree with us, then we can get at really our core values and our principles as individuals, and we're able to deeply explore what we think about things or how we want to do things. Because when you're in a bubble, no one's challenging you. You sort of assume that everything is done the same way, or or everybody thinks the same way, and that when we're randomly challenged, then we don't know how to respond and what to say, and that to me is important as I grow older, and as a professional, that I have good answers to what I believe, and not just assume that everybody believes what I believe.